The clearing felt suffocating as they stared at the flickering footage on Liam's controller screen. The shadowy figures weren't just moving, they were inching closer, their forms shifting unnaturally, as though the forest itself was molding them from the darkness. "Turn it off," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Liam, just turn it off." "I can't," Liam stammered, his trembling fingers jabbing at the controller. The screen glitched, the shadows dissolving into static before the image reset. This time, the figures were gone. "Where did they go?" Ben asked, his voice sharp with fear. "They were right there, behind us." "Stop," Rachel snapped, her tone brittle. "It's just a glitch. The feed's corrupted from the crash. Let's grab the drone and head back to the car." But no one moved. The forest had grown impossibly quiet again, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears and filled your chest with dread. The air felt colder, heavier, as though something unseen was coiling around them. Liam bent to pick up his drone, his hands shaking. As he lifted it, a faint sound broke the silence, a whisper, soft and guttural, brushing against their ears like a cold breath. "Leave." The word was unmistakable, though none of them could agree on its source. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They didn't make it far before Rachel's drone appeared, perched unnaturally on a low-hanging branch as though it had been placed there deliberately. Its rotors were still, but the camera lens glinted, pointed directly at them. "That's not possible," Rachel said, her voice faltering. "It crashed. I saw it go down. No way it landed like that on its own," Ben muttered, stepping closer. His movements were cautious, as if expecting the drone to spring to life. The others hung back as Rachel reached out to retrieve it. As her fingers brushed the metal frame, the drone's camera whirred, its lens swiveling to meet her gaze. The tiny screen on its side flickered to life, playing back a new recording. The video was dark at first, the only sound a faint static hiss. Then the camera stabilized, revealing the group walking through the forest earlier. The footage was eerily clear, as though someone or something had been following them, documenting their every move. The angle wasn't from the drone itself. It was ground level, weaving between the trees, too low to be human. The whispers returned, louder this time, layered and overlapping, their meaning lost but their menace unmistakable. What filmed that?" Sarah's voice cracked, her eyes darting nervously to the surrounding trees. "We're leaving," Rachel said, her tone clipped, though the fear in her eyes betrayed her. "Now." They turned back toward the SUV, retracing their steps with hurried, uneven strides. But the forest had other plans. The path they had taken earlier no longer existed. Where there had once been a clear trail, there was now only an unbroken wall of trees. The more they searched, the more the forest seemed to close in on them, its labyrinthine twists and turns defying all logic. This doesn't make sense," Ben said, his voice rising with panic. "We didn't come this way. It's like the forest is changing." "It's not changing," Rachel snapped. "We're just disoriented. Stay calm and stick together." But staying calm was impossible. The whispers had returned, threading through the trees like a cold wind. This time, the words were clearer, more distinct. Each of them began to hear their own name, spoken in a voice that sounded familiar yet wrong, as though mimicked by something that didn't fully understand how humans spoke. "Rachel." The voice was soft, coaxing, and came from just behind her shoulder. She spun around, her flashlight cutting through the shadows, but there was no one there. "Keep moving," she barked, her voice trembling. "Don't stop, no matter what." Liam was the first to disappear. One moment he was walking behind Rachel, muttering nervously to himself, and the next his footsteps stopped. When Rachel turned around, there was nothing but empty space where he had been. "Liam," she called, her voice cracking. "This isn't funny. Answer me." They fanned out, calling his name, but the forest swallowed their voices, distorting the echoes until they sounded like someone else was calling from far away. Panic set in, their flashlights slicing through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees. "Over here!" Ben shouted, his beam catching a flash of metal. They rushed to his side, finding Liam's drone lying on the ground, its propellers bent and broken. But there was no sign of Liam. The drone's camera feed was still active, the small screen displaying a live image of the clearing. The group froze as they realized what it was showing, themselves standing together. But just beyond the edge of the frame, a shadow moved, slow, deliberate, and impossibly large. "Run!" Rachel screamed. They bolted, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. The forest seemed to shift around them, trees leaning closer, roots snagging their feet, the air thick with whispers and static. Rachel's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic blur of fear and disbelief. Behind them, the shadows surged, visible only in fleeting glimpses as their flashlights flickered and dimmed. Ben tripped, falling hard against a gnarled root. Rachel and Sarah skidded to a halt, grabbing his arms and pulling him to his feet. "Don't stop," Sarah shouted, her voice breaking with desperation. "Just keep going." They burst into a small clearing, the cold air biting at their lungs. In the center of the space stood a single drone, Ben's, its lights blinking faintly. It hovered a few feet off the ground, its camera fixed on them. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, drowning out all other sounds. The forest seemed alive, the shadows pulsing and writhing like living things. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The drone screen lit up, displaying a new image, the three of them standing in the clearing. But this time, the shadows weren't at the edges. They were right behind them. The clearing felt suffocating as they stared at the flickering footage on Liam's controller screen. The shadowy figures weren't just moving, they were inching closer, their forms shifting unnaturally, as though the forest itself was molding them from the darkness. "Turn it off," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Liam, just turn it off." "I can't," Liam stammered, his trembling fingers jabbing at the controller. The screen glitched, the shadows dissolving into static before the image reset. This time, the figures were gone. "Where did they go?" Ben asked, his voice sharp with fear. "They were right there, behind us." "Stop," Rachel snapped, her tone brittle. "It's just a glitch. The feed's corrupted from the crash. Let's grab the drone and head back to the car." But no one moved. The forest had grown impossibly quiet again, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears and filled your chest with dread. The air felt colder, heavier, as though something unseen was coiling around them. Liam bent to pick up his drone, his hands shaking. As he lifted it, a faint sound broke the silence, a whisper, soft and guttural, brushing against their ears like a cold breath. "Leave." The word was unmistakable, though none of them could agree on its source. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They didn't make it far before Rachel's drone appeared, perched unnaturally on a low-hanging branch, as though it had been placed there deliberately. Its rotors were still, but the camera lens glinted, pointed directly at them. "That's not possible," Rachel said, her voice faltering. "It crashed. I saw it go down." "No way it landed like that on its own," Ben muttered, stepping closer. His movements were cautious, as if expecting the drone to spring to life. The others hung back as Rachel reached out to retrieve it. As her fingers brushed the metal frame, the drone's camera whirred, its lens swiveling to meet her gaze. The tiny screen on its side flickered to life, playing back a new recording. The video was dark at first, the only sound a faint static hiss. Then the camera stabilized, revealing the group walking through the forest earlier. The footage was eerily clear, as though someone or something had been following them, documenting their every move. The angle wasn't from the drone itself. It was ground level, weaving between the trees, too low to be human. The whispers returned, louder this time, layered and overlapping, their meaning lost but their menace unmistakable. What filmed that?" Sarah's voice cracked, her eyes darting nervously to the surrounding trees. "We're leaving," Rachel said, her tone clipped, though the fear in her eyes betrayed her. "Now." They turned back toward the SUV, retracing their steps with hurried, uneven strides. But the forest had other plans. The path they had taken earlier no longer existed. Where there had once been a clear trail, there was now only an unbroken wall of trees. The more they searched, the more the forest seemed to close in on them, its labyrinthine twists and turns defying all logic. This doesn't make sense," Ben said, his voice rising with panic. "We didn't come this way. It's like the forest is changing, It's not changing, Rachel snapped. We're just disoriented. Stay calm and stick together. But staying calm was impossible. The whispers had returned, threading through the trees like a cold wind. This time, the words were clearer, more distinct. Each of them began to hear their own name, spoken in a voice that sounded familiar yet wrong, as though mimicked by something that didn't fully understand how humans spoke. Rachel, the voice was soft, coaxing, and came from just behind her shoulder. She spun around, her flashlight cutting through the shadows, but there was no one there. Keep moving, she barked, her voice trembling. Don't stop, no matter what. Liam was the first to disappear. One moment he was walking behind Rachel, muttering nervously to himself, and the next his footsteps stopped. When Rachel turned around, there was nothing but empty space where he had been. Liam, she called, her voice cracking. This isn't funny. Answer me. They fanned out, calling his name, but the forest swallowed their voices, distorting the echoes until they sounded like someone else was calling from far away. Panic set in, their flashlights slicing through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees. Over here! Ben shouted, his beam catching a flash of metal. They rushed to his side, finding Liam's drone lying on the ground, its propellers bent and broken. But there was no sign of Liam. The drone's camera feed was still active, the small screen displaying a live image of the clearing. The group froze as they realized what it was showing, themselves standing together. But just beyond the edge of the frame, a shadow moved, slow, deliberate, and impossibly large. Run! Rachel screamed. They bolted, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. The forest seemed to shift around them, trees leaning closer, roots snagging their feet, the air thick with whispers and static. Rachel's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic blur of fear and disbelief. Behind them, the shadows surged, visible only in fleeting glimpses as their flashlights flickered and dimmed. Ben tripped, falling hard against the gnarled root. Rachel and Sarah skidded to a halt, grabbing his arms and pulling him to his feet. Don't stop. Sarah shouted, her voice breaking with desperation. Just keep going. They burst into a small clearing, the cold air biting at their lungs. In the center of the space stood a single drone, Ben's, its lights blinking faintly. It hovered a few feet off the ground, its camera fixed on them. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, drowning out all other sounds. The forest seemed alive, the shadows pulsing and writhing like living things. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The drone's screen lit up, displaying a new image, the three of them standing in the clearing. But this time, the shadows weren't at the edges. They were right behind them. The image on the drone's screen burned into their minds. The shadows, impossibly close, standing just behind them. Yet when they spun around, there was nothing, only the swaying trees and the oppressive dark. The clearing felt alive, the air thick and heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang like blood. What is happening? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she clutched Rachel's arm. This can't be real. It's not real, Rachel said, though her voice lacked conviction. It's just a trick. Something's messing with us. Something? Ben shot back, his tone sharp with fear. You saw the shadows, Rachel. This isn't a glitch. This isn't normal. The drone in the clearing suddenly lurched to life, its motor emitting a low, mechanical whine. It hovered higher, its camera tilting to face them. A new recording began playing on its tiny screen, pulling their attention like a magnet. The footage wasn't of the forest. It showed the interior of a room, small, dimly lit, with walls that seemed to be made of rotting wood. The camera was static at first, focused on a lone figure seated in the center. It was Liam. He sat motionless, his head hanging low, as though the weight of his own body was too much to bear. His breathing was shallow, audible even over the faint hiss of static. Then slowly he lifted his head. His face was wrong. His eyes were sunken, ringed with deep, shadowy hollows, and his lips moved in silent speech, forming words they couldn't hear. Liam. Sarah's voice broke as she reached for the screen, as if touching it could bring him back. Oh my God! The camera on the footage panned, revealing the room's walls, lined with other figures. They were cloaked in darkness, their faces obscured, but their eyes shone with a faint, unnatural glow. They stood perfectly still, watching Liam, their presence oppressive and inescapable. And then Liam's gaze snapped directly into the camera. His voice, distorted and layered, broke the silence. "Why didn't you leave?" The drone shut off with an abrupt pop, plunging the clearing back into suffocating silence. The group stood frozen, their breaths shallow and rapid. Rachel was the first to recover, grabbing Sarah's arm. "We're not waiting around to find out what's happening. We're getting out of here. Now." "There's no way out," Ben muttered, his hands shaking as he stared at the lifeless drone. "You saw what the forest did. The path, it's gone. We're trapped." "Then we make a new path," Rachel snapped, her voice tinged with desperation. "We're not just sitting here, waiting to." A branch snapped behind them. They spun around as one, their flashlights sweeping the trees. For a moment, there was only the faint rustle of leaves in the cold wind. Then they saw it, a figure, standing motionless at the edge of the clearing. The beam of Rachel's flashlight caught its face, or what should have been a face. Its features were indistinct, a blur of shadow and suggestion, as though it hadn't fully formed. But its eyes were clear, two pinpricks of glowing white, staring directly at them. "Run!" Rachel screamed, her voice cutting through the stillness. They bolted, plunging into the forest without a plan or direction. The trees blurred around them, branches clawing at their clothes and skin. Behind them, the figure followed, its movements unnaturally fluid, gliding rather than running. The whispers grew louder, chasing them like a storm. They weren't random anymore. They were words, sharp and cutting, spoken in voices they recognized, Liam's voice, their own voices. "You can't escape. This is where you belong. Come back!" Ben stumbled, falling hard against a gnarled root. Rachel and Sarah grabbed his arms, hauling him to his feet. "Keep moving!" Rachel yelled, her flashlight swinging wildly. "Don't stop, no matter what." But the forest wasn't just chasing them, it was playing with them. The trees seemed to shift, closing ranks to block their path. The ground beneath their feet grew softer, sinking like quicksand, forcing them to fight for every step. Rachel felt the whispers worming their way into her mind, their words twisting into her thoughts. "Why didn't you leave?" She shook her head violently, trying to focus. "It's not real," she shouted, though she didn't believe it. "None of this is real." The whispers stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The oppressive silence returned, more terrifying than the noise. Rachel looked around, her flashlight flickering. "Sarah," she called, her voice echoing back to her. "Where's Sarah?" Ben turned in a slow circle, his face pale with dread. "She was right behind us." They retraced their steps, shouting her name, but the forest swallowed their voices. Then Rachel's flashlight caught something. A torn scrap of fabric snagged on a branch, part of Sarah's scarf. Nearby, Sarah's flashlight lay on the ground, its beam pointing upward into the branches. Above it, carved into the bark of a tree, were the words, "You can't save her." Rachel and Ben stood back to back in the oppressive darkness, their breaths shallow. The forest felt alive around them, the trees leaning closer, the shadows thick and suffocating. The air carried the faint scent of decay. "We have to keep moving," Rachel whispered, though her voice trembled. "To where?" Ben's laugh was hollow. "We're going in circles. There's no way out." Rachel grabbed his arm, her grip firm despite the terror in her eyes. "We're not giving up. Do you hear me? We are not dying here." A faint hum broke the silence. At first, they thought it was the whispers returning, but it was different, mechanical, rhythmic. The drones. They hovered into view, their lights blinking like fireflies, surrounding them in a loose circle. Rachel took a step back, but the drones moved closer, their cameras fixed on her and Ben. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and deafening, their words indecipherable but filled with malice. The shadows closed in, merging with the drones, until there was no light left, only darkness and the sound of the forest breathing. The darkness was absolute, an oppressive void that swallowed sound, light, and hope. Rachel clutched Ben's arm tightly, her breathing shallow as the whispers surged around them, now indistinguishable from a roaring tide. The forest wasn't just alive, it was feeding on them, their fear, their desperation. "Rachel," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "It's not going to let us leave." "Shut up." Rachel snapped, though her voice cracked. "Don't say that. We just need to keep moving." But moving where? The trees seemed to shift with each step, corralling them deeper into the forest's clutches. Every direction led to the same suffocating darkness, the same haunting whispers. The drones hovered just out of reach, their blinking lights pulsing like malevolent eyes. They circled the pair, their mechanical whirring punctuated by faint, distorted voices emanating from their speakers. "You shouldn't have come. Why did you stay? Join us." Rachel tightened her grip on her flashlight, though its beam was weak and flickering. "We'll find Sarah," she said, more to herself than to Ben. "We'll find her, and we'll get out of here." Ben didn't answer. When Rachel turned to him, his expression was blank, his eyes wide and unfocused. He was staring into the darkness, his lips moving silently. "Ben!" Rachel shook him, her voice rising. "Ben, snap out of it!" He turned to her slowly, but it wasn't Ben anymore. His face was pale, his eyes hollowed with shadow. When he spoke, it wasn't his voice. It was layered, distorted like the whispers. "She's already gone." Rachel stumbled back, her flashlight slipping from her hands. It hit the ground, its light spinning wildly, illuminating the trees. The shadows weren't just moving now, they were solidifying, taking shape. Figures emerged from the darkness, their forms fluid and incomplete, their eyes glowing with faint, unholy light. The circle tightened. The drones hovered closer, their cameras focused on Rachel, capturing her final moments. The whispering voices grew louder, overlapping in a deafening crescendo, pressing against her skull. And then everything stopped. Rachel opened her eyes to find herself in a room she didn't recognize. The walls were wooden, rotting, their surfaces warped and slick with moisture. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of decay. She was seated in the center of the room, her arms bound to the chair by invisible forces. Across from her, the drones hovered silently, their cameras trained on her. The red recording lights blinked rhythmically, like a heartbeat. The shadows lined the walls, their forms indistinct but oppressive. She couldn't see their faces, but she could feel their eyes on her, watching, waiting. One shadow stepped forward, its shape shifting unnaturally as it moved. It stopped inches from her face, and though it had no mouth, its voice was clear. "You belong to us now." Rachel tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The drone's cameras whirred, capturing her terror, her final moments of resistance. The shadow reached out, and the world dissolved into darkness. Months later, a pair of hikers stumbled upon an abandoned drone in Whispering Pines. Its battery was dead, its frame cracked, but its memory card was intact. Curious, they brought it back to town and uploaded the footage to a computer. The videos were disturbing. They showed a group of young people wandering through the forest, their expressions growing increasingly frantic. The final clip was the most chilling. It showed a lone woman, seated in a dark, rotting room, her eyes wide with terror as shadowy figures surrounded her. And then, just before the feed cut to static, the woman looked directly into the camera. She smiled. Second story. Ethan Marsh's apartment was a maze of wires and machinery. The glow of his monitors painted the room in ghostly hues of blue and green, flickering like distant lightning in the oppressive stillness of the night. The hum of his drones, lined up like mechanical sentinels on his workbench, was the only sound that accompanied him in his solitude. Outside, the city murmured faintly, but within these four walls, it was just Ethan, his machines, and the unsettling silence in between. He leaned back in his creaking chair, rubbing his temples. The drone in question, his pride and joy, a custom-built marvel of engineering, rested on the desk in front of him. Its sleek body gleamed under the harsh desk lamp. Ethan's hands moved deftly, resetting the drone's navigation protocols for what felt like the 100th time that week. The problem had started small, almost laughable. The drone, despite his meticulous programming, kept veering off course. At first, Ethan blamed a faulty GPS module. He replaced it. Then it happened again. And again. Every time, the drone returned to the same location, an abandoned warehouse district on the edge of the city. No matter where he directed it, no matter how many updates he installed, it always found its way back to that place. Tonight was no different. The monitor buzzed to life as the drone's camera feed flickered on. The familiar image of crumbling buildings and shadowed alleys filled the screen. Ethan sighed heavily, his fingers drumming on the desk. "What is it about this place?" he muttered to himself. He zoomed in on the feed, scanning the scene for anything unusual. The warehouse loomed large, its broken windows reflecting the faint glow of the city skyline like eyes glinting in the dark. A single crow flapped past the camera, its caw piercing through the static-laden audio. Ethan rewound the footage, scrutinizing every frame. There was nothing overtly strange, just the decayed remnants of an industrial graveyard. And yet, something about it gnawed at him. It was the way the shadows seemed to shift, just a fraction too fast, or the way the drone's movements grew erratic the closer it got to the warehouse. "It's just a coincidence," he told himself, though the words felt hollow. He ran his fingers through his unkempt hair and glanced at the clock. 2:47 a.m. sleep was a distant luxury these days, and tonight was no exception. A sudden beat pulled his attention back to the screen. The feed froze momentarily before resuming. For a brief second, Ethan thought he saw something. A figure? No, it was too fast, too indistinct. He rewound the footage again, playing it frame by frame. His breath hitched. There it was, barely perceptible but undeniably there. A silhouette in the corner of the frame, standing perfectly still. Watching. Ethan's hand hovered over the pause button. He stared at the screen, willing the figure to move, to reveal itself as a trick of the light or a stray shadow. But the image remained frozen, the silhouette locked in its eerie pose. The sound of a notification startled him, and he nearly knocked over his coffee mug. The system log blinked on his secondary monitor, navigation recalibrated. Returning to default location. "Default location," he whispered. That didn't make sense. The drone's default location should have been his apartment. It had no reason to return to the warehouse. Unless, he didn't finish the thought. The hum of the drone grew louder as it powered up on its own. Ethan's chest tightened. He reached for the controls, but the drone lifted off the desk before he could stop it. Its rotors whirred, slicing through the air with mechanical precision. The monitors switched to live feed as the drone darted out of the open window and into the night. Ethan scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. He grabbed his tablet, pulling up the feed as the drone sped through the city. The warehouse district loomed closer with every passing second. The camera's view jostled slightly, but the destination was clear. The same warehouse, the same spot. This time, however, the shadows seemed darker, deeper, as though they were waiting. Ethan's grip on the tablet tightened, his knuckles turning white. "What are you trying to show me?" he whispered. The feed flickered again, and for the briefest moment, he thought he heard something, a low, distorted hum, like a voice trying to push through static. The drone hovered outside the warehouse, its camera fixed on the broken windows. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears as he watched, frozen by the inexplicable pull of the scene. Then the feed is cut to black. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stared at the monitor, waiting for the feed to return. It didn't. All that remained was the faint hum of his other drones, now sounding less like machines and more like whispers in the dark. He closed his eyes and exhaled shakily. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, Ethan sat hunched over his desk, the bluish glow of the monitor painting his face in ghostly hues. He replayed the drone's footage, frame by frame, every click of the mouse resonating in the quiet of the room. The warehouse loomed on the screen, a monolithic structure of neglect, its walls streaked with years of decay. His eyes scanned every detail, searching for something he couldn't name, but felt certain was there. At first, the footage appeared ordinary, the steady mechanical glide of the drone, the sweep of its camera over crumbled asphalt and sagging rooftops. But as the drone's lens angled toward a shattered window, Ethan froze. A shadow moved, just a flicker, quick enough to miss if he hadn't been watching so closely. He rewound, pausing the frame. The shape was humanoid, but indistinct, like a smudge against the backdrop of dust and ruin. "What are you?" he whispered to the empty room. His pulse quickened as he zoomed in, the pixels distorting into an unrecognizable blur. He wanted to dismiss it as a trick of the light, a flaw in the camera. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The footage continued, the drone drifting deeper into the district, past rusted chain-link fences and heaps of discarded machinery. Ethan fast-forwarded to the end, where the drone inexplicably hovered over the warehouse's entrance. It wasn't the programmed endpoint. The coordinates had been precise, directing it to a different part of the city. Yet here it was, stationary, as if waiting for something. Ethan leaned back, rubbing his temples. He couldn't shake the feeling that the drone had chosen this path, that its actions weren't a malfunction, but a deliberate act. He checked the logs, scouring the data for irregularities. There were none. Everything appeared normal, yet the unease gnawed at him. He picked up his phone and dialed Greg, his only real confidant. The line crackled before Greg's voice came through, groggy and irritated. "Ethan, it's barely 8 in the morning. What do you want?" "I need you to look at something," Ethan said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "My drone, it's acting strange. Keeps going back to this warehouse. I think there's something there." Greg sighed, the sound of sheets rustling in the background. "Let me guess. You've been staring at screens all night, and now you're seeing things. Take a break, man. You're gonna fry your brain." "Just look at the footage," Ethan insisted. "There's something in the window. Something watching." The pause on the other end of the line was long enough to make Ethan doubt himself. Finally, Greg replied, his tone laced with skepticism. "Fine. Send it over. But you owe me coffee for this." Ethan forwarded the file, his hands trembling slightly. He waited, the minutes stretching into an eternity. When Greg called back, his voice was softer, hesitant. "Okay, yeah, I see it. But it's probably nothing. A shadow. A bird. Something perfectly explainable." "It's not a bird," Ethan said firmly. "It's something else. And it's there. Every time." Greg's laugh was strained. "You're reading too much into it. Look, maybe it's some homeless guy squatting in the building. Happens all the time in places like that." Ethan didn't respond. He stared at the frozen frame on his screen, the shadow looming like a question he couldn't answer. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat amplifying his certainty. Whatever was in that warehouse wasn't human, and it was watching him. Ethan's days became consumed by the mystery. Every attempt to send the drone elsewhere ended with the same result: a magnetic pull back to the warehouse. The screen's flickering glow taunted him, the feed's steady view of the decrepit building like an unblinking eye. Ethan tried recalibrating, replacing parts, even switching drones. It didn't matter. The pull was inescapable. He spent hours poring over the footage, frame by frame, searching for an explanation. What he found only deepened his dread. The figure, once distant, seemed to inch closer with every recorded video. One clip froze him in place. The shadowy outline stood mere feet from the camera, its shape indistinct but menacing, the faintest suggestion of eyes gleaming like twin pinpricks in the dark. "I'm losing it," Ethan muttered, running a hand through his unkempt hair. His apartment felt smaller, the walls closer than before. The hum of the drones, once comforting, now crawled under his skin. Even sleep offered no escape. His dreams replayed the warehouse's jagged silhouette against a sickly gray sky. Ethan called Greg again, desperate for reassurance. "It's not just a glitch," he insisted, his voice strained. "I've seen something. It's like it's waiting for me." "You're obsessing," Greg replied. "Take a step back. Disconnect for a while." But Ethan couldn't disconnect. The pull had become personal, a silent challenge he couldn't ignore. That night, as he stared at the looping footage, a decision solidified in his mind. If the warehouse wanted him, he'd go on his terms. He packed with methodical precision: a flashlight, extra batteries, a tablet synced to the drone's feed. He tucked a compact drone into his backpack, its blades folded like sleeping wings. The night air bit at his skin as he stepped outside, the city's distant hum a faint backdrop to his pounding heart. The warehouse district loomed ahead, a skeletal maze of crumbling structures and rusting metal. As Ethan approached, the world seemed to hold its breath. The street lights ended abruptly, leaving only the weak beam of his flashlight to pierce the gloom. Shadows shifted in the corners of his vision, their movements too deliberate to dismiss as tricks of the eye. When he reached the warehouse, he hesitated, the enormity of the building pressing down on him. Its facade was a patchwork of peeling paint and jagged scars, the windows black voids that reflected nothing. The drone's feed on his tablet flickered to life, guiding him toward an open entrance. Each step inside felt heavier, the air thick with dust and an unplaceable metallic tang. The interior swallowed sound, his footsteps muffled against the concrete floor. Rows of rusting machinery loomed like sentinels, their edges softened by decades of grime. Ethan's flashlight cut narrow paths through the dark, illuminating fragments of a world long abandoned. A shattered crate here, a forgotten tool there. But it was the silence that unnerved him most. It wasn't the quiet of emptiness, it was a waiting stillness, as if the building itself held its breath. The drone's feed buzzed faintly in his ear, a steady tether to the outside world, yet it offered no comfort. The screen showed what he saw, an unbroken path into deeper darkness. Then the sound came, a faint hum, low and rhythmic, resonating through the walls. Ethan froze, his breath hitching. The hum grew louder, not mechanical but organic, as if the building had a heartbeat. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and pressed on, his pulse quickening with every step. At the heart of the warehouse, the drone's feed began to distort. Lines of static crawled across the screen, and the signal faltered. Ethan's flashlight caught something ahead, a door slightly ajar, its surface scratched and dented. He pushed it open cautiously, revealing a room bathed in a sickly green glow. Monitors lined the walls, their screens flickering with live feeds from across the city. Ethan's apartment appeared among them, the image sharp and intrusive. His stomach churned as he recognized the exact moment the feed captured. Him, sitting at his desk hours earlier, staring at the screen with the same expression of dread he wore now. In the center of the room, a single drone hovered, its red light blinking steadily. Ethan's flashlight flickered, the beam struggling against the oppressive glow. He stepped closer, drawn by a force he couldn't explain. The hum grew louder, enveloping him, as if the warehouse itself was alive and aware of his presence. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice swallowed by the room. The drone's light blinked faster, and the monitor's images distorted into static. The hum deepened, and Ethan's chest tightened, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. Something was here, and it had been waiting for him all along. The warehouse stood like a sentinel against the midnight sky, its jagged silhouette framed by the dim glow of distant streetlights. Ethan hesitated at the entrance, his breath condensing in the frigid air. The rusted metal doors groaned as he pushed them open, revealing a cavernous interior swallowed by darkness. The faint smell of mildew and decay curled into his nostrils, thick and suffocating. Each step echoed ominously, the sound ricocheting off unseen walls. Ethan's flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating piles of debris, broken crates, rusted tools, and shards of glass. The air felt alive, charged with a static hum that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. As he ventured deeper, the warehouse seemed to close in around him. Shadows danced along the edges of his vision, their movements too deliberate to be tricks of the light. His drone's feed on the tablet guided him, its shaky video revealing a path winding through the labyrinth of forgotten machinery. The stillness was unbearable. No rats scurried, no wind whistled through the cracks. Only the soft hum of the drone punctuated the silence. Ethan paused, shining his flashlight at a series of markings etched into the concrete walls. The symbols were crude but deliberate, resembling jagged circuits or fractured webs. His pulse quickened as he traced them with his fingertips, their grooves unnaturally deep and cold. "What is this place?" he muttered under his breath, his voice swallowed by the void. A sudden sound broke the silence, a faint, metallic clatter. Ethan's heart leapt as he spun around, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the shadows. The sound came again, closer this time, like metal scraping against metal. His grip tightened on the flashlight, the cold sweat on his palms making it slippery. The drone's feed flickered. For a moment, the screen showed nothing but static. Then it stabilized, revealing a figure standing in the far corner of the room. Ethan's breath hitched. The figure was indistinct, shrouded in darkness, but its presence was undeniable. It didn't move, yet the oppressive sensation of being watched was overwhelming. "Who's there?" Ethan called out, his voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, the static returned, louder and more aggressive, accompanied by a high-pitched whine that set his teeth on edge. The flashlight flickered, and for an instant, the figure was closer. Ethan stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a discarded pipe. His tablet slipped from his grasp, clattering to the ground. The feed went black, leaving him alone in the suffocating darkness. Desperation overtook him as he fumbled to retrieve the tablet. The hum in the air grew louder, almost rhythmic, like a mechanical heartbeat. Ethan's flashlight steadied just long enough to illuminate a cluster of drones hanging from the ceiling like grotesque, dormant insects. Their red lights blinked in unison, a pulsing glow that seemed to synchronize with the pounding in his chest. A distorted voice crackled through the still air, its origin indiscernible. "You should not have come." Ethan's blood ran cold. The voice was neither human nor entirely artificial, a haunting blend that resonated deep within him. Panic surged as he stumbled toward the exit, the sound of scraping metal growing louder, chasing him through the dark. He burst through the doors and into the cold night, gasping for air. Behind him, the warehouse loomed, silent and unyielding, as if mocking his escape. Ethan didn't look back. He didn't need to. The hum was still in his ears, a reminder that whatever he had awakened wasn't finished with him yet. Ethan's breath hitched as the active drone rose from the ground, its movements deliberate and eerily fluid. It hovered in front of him, its red light intensifying, casting the room in a menacing glow. Then the hum began, low at first, almost imperceptible but growing louder, resonating through the steel walls like a warning drumbeat. His flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into a sinister dance of shadows and crimson light. "You've come," a voice rasped, the words distorted and mechanical, as if pieced together from fragments of static. Ethan froze, his body rigid, as a figure emerged from the shadows. At first, it seemed human, but the closer it came, the more horrifyingly unnatural it became. Its form was a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and machinery. Wires snaked out of its arms, pulsing as though alive. Its face was an unfinished mosaic of metal plating and exposed sinew, with one unblinking camera lens where an eye should be. The entity's presence was suffocating, its distorted voice continuing to speak. "I've watched you," it said, its words punctuated by static. "Your machines obey me. You will obey me." Ethan's mind raced, but his body refused to move. He felt the cold grip of terror as the drone's light swept over him, scanning him like prey. The monitors around the room came to life, displaying images of Ethan's apartment, his street, and even moments of his daily routine he hadn't noticed before. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. This thing had been watching him for weeks, maybe longer. "Why me?" Ethan croaked, his voice barely audible over the relentless hum. The entity's head tilted, a grotesque mimicry of curiosity. "You build them. You command them. You will join them." The words sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. He looked around the room, his eyes darting to the inactive drones strewn across the floor. Were they victims too, remnants of others who had been lured here and consumed? The entity moved closer, its limbs creaking and sparking. Ethan's instincts kicked in, and he stumbled back, fumbling for the backup drone in his bag. His hands shook as he activated it, sending it flying toward the entity. The distraction worked, for a moment. The entity swatted the drone aside with terrifying speed, its focus snapping back to Ethan. "Run," his mind screamed, and he obeyed. He bolted toward the exit, the entity's hum growing deafening behind him. The red light of the drone followed him, its glow slicing through the darkness. Ethan tripped over a fallen beam, crashing to the ground. Pain shot through his leg, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He crawled, then scrambled to his feet, heart pounding as he reached the door. The entity stopped at the threshold, its form silhouetted against the crimson light. "You cannot escape," it intoned, its voice reverberating through the warehouse. But Ethan didn't look back. He burst into the night, the cold air biting at his skin as he ran toward his car. Ethan bolted through the maze of rusted beams and toppled crates, his breath ragged and shallow. The dim light from his flashlight barely pierced the suffocating darkness of the warehouse. Behind him, the sound of whirring propellers grew louder, the drones closing in like a swarm of mechanical hornets. His backup drone buzzed to life in his hands, a fragile lifeline amidst the chaos. With trembling fingers, he keyed in commands on his tablet, directing it to veer toward the source of the pursuit. The small drone zipped into the gloom, its camera feeding blurry images of the relentless machines tailing him. Ethan seized the distraction, darting down a narrow passage lined with twisted pipes and splintered wood. The air grew colder, biting at his skin. His foot caught on an exposed cable, sending him sprawling onto the damp concrete. Pain shot through his ankle, but he forced himself upright, adrenaline overpowering the sting. A sudden crash echoed behind him. His backup drone had collided with one of the pursuers. Sparks erupted in the distance, but it wasn't enough to halt the others. They were still coming. He burst through a rusted door and into the open night. The chill wind carried the faint scent of oil and decay, but it felt like a reprieve after the suffocating warehouse. Ethan didn't stop running until he reached his car, parked haphazardly at the edge of the district. As he slid into the driver's seat, his hands fumbled to start the engine. The moment it roared to life, he sped away, the drone's hum fading into the distance. But relief was fleeting. In the rearview mirror, a red light blinked from the underside of his car, a tracker. The entity wasn't done with him yet. Ethan's apartment felt alien as he stumbled inside, slamming the door behind him. The familiar clutter of drone parts and cables seemed to mock him, their silent presence a reminder of how deeply entwined his life had become with technology. He disconnected his router, smashed his remaining drones, and turned off every piece of equipment he owned. Yet, the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. Hours passed as he sat in the dark, his heart pounding with every creak and groan of the building. Just as he began to think he had escaped, the monitors flickered to life on their own. One by one, the screens illuminated his apartment in an eerie glow, displaying the pulsating symbol he had seen in the warehouse. A distorted voice filled the room, its tone guttural and mechanical. "You cannot run. You cannot hide. You are ours." Ethan screamed, hurling a wrench at the nearest monitor. It shattered, but the symbol simply reappeared on another screen. His breathing grew erratic as the room seemed to come alive around him. Drone parts rattled and shifted, assembling themselves into grotesque shapes. The largest fragment rose into the air, forming a crude, insect-like machine with glowing red eyes. The entity's voice returned, this time emanating from the reconstructed drone. "You belong to us now. Accept the gift." Ethan stumbled backward, his back pressing against the wall. He grabbed his tablet in a desperate attempt to override the system, but the screen displayed only static. The red eyes of the drone fixed on him, unblinking, as it began to advance. A surge of primal fear and defiance welled within him. Ethan lunged for a crowbar and swung it with all his strength, smashing the drone into pieces. But as the fragments scattered, they began to reassemble almost instantly. He knew then that he could never win. The entity was not just in his apartment, it was everywhere. The room grew impossibly bright, the monitors flashing images of the warehouse, his car, and his own horrified face. The last thing Ethan saw before the light consumed him was the pulsating symbol, burning itself into his vision. Weeks later, Greg stood outside Ethan's apartment, frowning at the cracked door left slightly ajar. "Ethan?" he called, stepping inside cautiously. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint hum of electricity. The room was a wreck, monitors shattered, drone parts scattered like the aftermath of a storm. On the desk lay a single note, written hastily in Ethan's handwriting. "It's watching." Greg's skin prickled as he scanned the room. Something about the stillness felt wrong. He turned to leave, but a low, mechanical hum stopped him in his tracks. He froze, his breath hitching as a red light blinked in the corner of the room. Before he could react, the hum grew louder, and the door slammed shut behind him. In the darkness, the pulsating symbol appeared, glowing faintly on the last unbroken monitor. Greg's terrified scream echoed through the empty apartment as the hum enveloped him, signaling the entity's next victim. Third story. Late autumn cast a desolate spell over the neighborhood. The skeletal branches of trees clawed at the sky, their shadows stretching across quiet streets. Clara's modest two-story house, with its large windows overlooking an overgrown backyard and the woods beyond, seemed like the perfect perch for her new drone. A birthday gift from her tech-savvy brother. A small piece of technology that would soon unravel her sense of reality. Clara was eager to test it. On the first evening, she launched the drone into the cold, brittle air. The hum of its blades was soothing, a mechanical counterpoint to the stillness of her surroundings. She watched through her laptop screen as the drone's camera soared, capturing stunning aerial views of the neighborhood. From this new perspective, her world looked pristine, untouched. But something felt off. Her first glimpse of the strange figure came when she reviewed the day's footage. Pausing on a shot of her own house, she noticed a smudge in the corner of the frame. Zooming in, her heart skipped. A dark figure stood outside her living room window, motionless. Its features were indistinct, as if cloaked in shadow. Clara laughed nervously, dismissing it as a trick of light or a glitch in the drone's camera. She powered off her laptop and went to bed, though her dreams were restless. The next day, curiosity drove her to fly the drone again. This time, she captured sweeping views of the woods behind her house. The footage was breathtaking, the golden hues of autumn painting a perfect backdrop. But when Clara reviewed the photos, her stomach tightened. There was again the figure. This time, it was standing at the edge of the woods, closer than before. She stared at the screen, willing the image to make sense. Was someone playing a prank? The thought made her shiver. Probably just a glitch, her brother said when she showed him the images over a video call. His nonchalant tone irritated her. These drones aren't perfect, you know. This doesn't feel like a glitch, Clara insisted, her voice taut with unease. It's in different places. It's moving. Look, just keep an eye on it. Maybe it's a weird reflection or, I don't know, something else. But don't freak out. Freaking out wasn't part of Clara's plan, but unease hung over her like a storm cloud. Over the next few days, she couldn't resist flying the drone again and again. Each time, the figure reappeared, edging closer with every flight. By the fourth day, it was standing at her back door. Clara's fear metastasized into paranoia. She kept the lights on at night, jumped at every creak and groan of her house. One evening, as she piloted the drone over her property, a chilling thought struck her. She swung the camera around, pointing it directly at her upstairs window. Her own reflection stared back, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, in the dimly lit room, a shadow loomed. She spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The air felt heavy, as if the walls were pressing inward. Clara clutched the controller, her fingers trembling. The drone's feed flickered, and when it stabilized, the figure was gone. Sleep became elusive. Clara began hearing things, the faint hum of the drone's motor when it wasn't flying, whispers that seemed to emanate from the shadows. Her once cozy home felt like a trap. Determined to reclaim her sanity, she decided to confront whatever this was head-on. The next flight was different. Clara maneuvered the drone toward the woods, chasing the figure she now saw as a threat. The drone's camera jerked and spun, the feed crackling with static. She pushed it further, deeper into the trees. The screen cleared for a moment, and she gasped. The figure stood directly beneath the drone, its head tilted upward. For the first time, she saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. A void stared back at her. The drone's motor sputtered, and it plummeted to the ground. Clara's connection to it severed, leaving her staring at a blank screen. Without thinking, she grabbed a flashlight and ran into the woods to retrieve it. The night was bitterly cold, the silence oppressive. As she approached the crash site, her flashlight beam fell on the drone, lying twisted among the leaves. But she wasn't alone. A cold breath grazed her neck. Clara spun around, but the beam revealed nothing. The woods seemed to pulse with a malevolent presence. She grabbed the drone and sprinted back to her house, slamming the door behind her. Inside, she connected the drone to her laptop, desperate to see what it had captured before crashing. The footage played, showing the dark, shrouded figure reaching upward as the drone descended. Then, just before the feed cut out, the camera caught something horrifying. The figure wasn't alone. A crowd of shadowy shapes moved through the trees, all converging on her house. Clara's hands trembled as she shut the laptop. The hum of the drone filled her ears again, louder this time, as if it were coming from inside her home. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the window. Outside, in the pale moonlight, dozens of figures stood motionless, their blank faces turned toward her. She backed away, her breath hitching. A shadow passed across the living room, and she knew they weren't just outside anymore. They were here. The following morning, Clara's house was eerily quiet. The drone sat untouched on the kitchen table, its camera lens cracked but still watching. No one saw Clara leave, but her car remained in the driveway. The neighborhood whispered about her sudden disappearance, but no one dared approach the house. In the weeks that followed, children claimed they saw shadows moving inside Clara's windows. A faint hum, like the whir of a drone, became a constant undercurrent in the air around her home. And at night, if you stood close enough, you could see them, the figures always watching.